So it's 3 minutes after the hour. I have a few things I want to say by way of introduction, and that will allow some time for perhaps a few other people to join. So welcome everybody. I want to thank you for joining us this evening for a really special presentation and discussion focusing on the status of salmon and steelhead populations in the Columbian snake rivers and how that is impacting southern resident orca that rely mainly on Chinook salmon for their diet, their reproduction, and their survival. My name is Joseph Bogart. I'm the executive director of the Save Our Wild Salmon Coalition. SOS is a nearly 30-year-old coalition of conservation organizations, fishing associations, orca and clean energy advocates that have been working together to protect and restore abundant fishable populations of wild salmon and steelhead in the Snake and Columbia rivers for the benefit of people, fish and wildlife, and ecosystems. But before I introduce our guests, I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. 2020 has proven to be a terribly challenging year. A pandemic, associated economic pain and disruption and health problems for many, or worse, death. A necessary nationwide movement demanding justice, equality, and opportunity for all. And of course, now we're in the midst of the political season in what feels like for me to be the most consequential election of my lifetime. Amidst all this activity and tumult, I want to thank you all for joining us here. And this evening, I'm particularly excited by in large part because the topic and the guests we have the honor of joining us tonight. I want to welcome Dr. Sam Wasser and Giulia Good-Stefani, and thank you both for joining us this evening. I've known Sam for many years. I can't quite remember how many, Sam, when we used to be neighbors. And I've worked with Giulia for 4 or 5 years, closely on the salmon restoration campaign in the Columbia snake system. These are both wonderful people and very accomplished leaders in the natural resource arena, and I think we're in for a really special evening. I'll first introduce Sam and then Giulia, and then hand it over to Sam to start things off with his presentation. And I'll just tell you to start that Sam has a very long and impressive resume and record of accomplishment. And despite all my efforts to hack it down, it's still long and impressive. He holds an endowed chair in conservation biology at the University of Washington, where he is a professor in the Department of Biology and the director of the Center for Conservation Biology. He's recognized worldwide for developing non-invasive tools for monitoring human impacts on wildlife. He's pioneered methods to measure abundance, distribution, and physiological condition of wildlife based on feces, relying on often on detection dogs to locate samples over large wilderness areas or ocean areas too. He uses these methods to address diverse conservation questions, including impacts of poaching, oil development, overfishing, and on the well-being of multiple endangered species populations. He's also used these tools for forensic analysis of to detect and track transnational wildlife crime. His high-tech techniques have been used to determine geographic origins of poached ivory, for example, and uncover strategies that transnational organized crime syndicates use to acquire and move their contraband around the world. His work has led to prosecutions of major transnational ivory traffickers and nurtured important collaborations internationally to combat wildlife crime. Sam's worked at the Smithsonian. He was an assistant professor at the University of Washington in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and was the scientific director at the Woodland Park Zoo. In 2001, he was awarded the endowed chair in conservation biology at the University of Washington, right here near me at this point, anyways. And he is currently a research professor at UW Department of Biology and director of their Center for Conservation Biology. As we'll learn tonight, Sam's pioneering research on the southern resident orcas has been crucial to understanding the challenges facing these amazing whales and what solutions need to involve. Welcome, Sam. Giulia Good-Stefani also has a diverse work experience. She currently works for the Natural Resources Defense Council as an attorney and campaigner to protect marine mammals and other wildlife, wild places, and communities from environmental injustice and degradation. Prior to joining NRDC, she taught and supervised a law clinic at the Yale Law School, working for a small LA law. She worked for a small LA law firm and clerked for a judge in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Today, she represents NRDC on the Orca Salmon Alliance. She served as an advisor as part of Governor Inslee's Orca Task Force in 2018. And she holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Dartmouth College and a JD from Yale Law School. Giulia works out of Mosier, Oregon, where she lives with her partner, Andrew. There are 3 girls and a multitude of dogs, horses, and other animals. So welcome, Giulia. So that's my introduction. Sam, I think I want to hand it over to you. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Look forward to your presentation and discussion.
Thank you, Joseph. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the long introduction. But yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here and to be talking about this really important issue. I think I'll just dive right in and start showing some of the slides for the presentation. Okay, can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Yes.
You can. Okay, good. So you only see one picture up there, just making sure.
Looks great.
Okay. All right, great. Well, I'm going to talk about nutritional causes of endangerment in the southern resident killer whales. We've been studying them since 2007, and this is the primary area where we work in the Salish Sea, in the Harrow Strait here, going up to the Strait of Georgia and the Strait of Juan de Fuca, but really this is our primary study area right here. The southern resident killer whales are unique among killer whales because they have an exclusive diet on Chinook salmon. Northern residents killer whales also have that dietary specialization, as do Alaskan residents, but they differ from the marine mammal eating killer whales or the big killer whales, which eat primarily marine mammals. So you have a unique situation where you've got essentially an endangered species feeding on an endangered species. The killer whales have, they were listed as endangered in 2005, and the reason for the endangerment listing is because of their decline. This purple line is showing you all 3 populations together, and you can see its trajectory over time, and it's now at a low of 73 animals. Doesn't count the new babies. And you can see also that trend was characteristic really of all 3 pods. So this is L pod, which you can see progressive decline, J pod, where you can see a progressive decline, and then K, which has just always been fairly low and is staying low. The other thing about them is not only are they losing animals, they're not making any either. This shows you over time the number of reproductive age females in the population. And you can see that they pretty much have been stable at around 30 animals. The killer whales have a 5-year interbirth interval, which means that these 30 animals should have an average of about 6 births a year. And when you look at the number of births per year, this being the line for 6, you can see that's only been achieved twice. since 2007. And in fact, there have been years where there have been, very, very few births at all. So it appears that they're having, not only are they suffering mortality, but they're not making many babies. And unfortunately, the vast majority of babies that they have had have been sex biased in favor of male offspring, which are not, that's not a very good trend if you're trying to increase your population growth, because you really need females to do that. So they became endangered in the US in 2005, and Canada listed them as a species at risk in 2001. And there really are three major threats that have been listed as impacting the whales. The first is loss of Chinook salmon prey. And a second one is the exposure to a variety of persistent organic pollutants such as PCB, DDT, PBDE, all toxins that are pervasive in the environment. And a third cause of their decline, or hypothesized cause of their decline, is vessel traffic. Not only traffic from tankers like you see here, but also from the pressure put on them by the whale watch industry. Sometimes there are as many as 100 boats around 10 whales, and that number of boats will often persist all day long. Of course, boats get tired and they leave, but by the time they leave, other boats have found the whales because they look for all the other tourist boats, and the whales never get a break from dawn till dusk. So it becomes really challenging to be able to partition these various pressures to really understand what's going on and how should we prioritize the mitigation to try to help them. And really, all of our research is pointing to the primary variable impacting them as being lack of fish. This is showing you Chinook salmon back in the early 1900s, and you can see they were massive. I mean, you have salmon, between 90 and 120 pounds here, the size of the men that caught them, and now the fish weigh about maybe a quarter that amount. So not only have we lost a large number of Chinook salmon, their primary prey, but also we have seen a tremendous diminishing in size of their prey. And of course, to catch a smaller fish takes the same or even more effort as it does to catch a big fish, but you got to catch a lot more of them to persist. This graph here shows you all the different fish runs in the Pacific Northwest that, going from Oregon, from California up through British Columbia. And really what I want you to see, so this is the cumulative amount of fish, and you can see the various runs here, which are labeled here. But the most important thing is that you can see you have these peaks and troughs. And up here, the purple lines are showing you where you had the time periods that you had the greatest mortality and how that coincides with these peaks and troughs. And you can see that when you got a trough here, you get a peak in mortality, and it's pretty consistent pattern, which is really suggesting that the amount of fish available to these animals is really, really impacting their mortality. Well, we have a kind of unique way of studying these whales, as Joseph implied. We, many years ago, pioneered methods to train detection dogs to locate scat of endangered species. We first started this on terrestrial animals, and then we started work on marine mammals, and especially cetaceans. Our first work was in the North Atlantic right whale population off of coast of Maine. And then we, being from the Pacific Northwest and really caring deeply about these whales, it occurred to us that we could apply these methods to the northern resident killer whales, southern resident killer whales. Now, why do we want the dogs to detect scat? And that's really an important question. And one of the main reasons is that the scat provide a treasure trove of information, and its collection is totally non-invasive. So for example, from an individual scat sample, we can get DNA. So we can tell from that the species that left the sample, the killer whale. We can tell whether it's a male or a female. We can actually identify it down to the individual so that we can tell what individual that came from. And we can also, from the DNA in the scat, tell what different prey species it was eating. So we can focus in on not only whether it was Chinook or not, but also the runs of it, of the Chinook runs that they're eating. We can get microbiome. Some of you may have heard about microbiome. In recent years, there's been a lot of attention paid to that. And it's an extremely important metric that of the bacteria that's sympatric in our body and really has a commensal relationship with us in terms of enhancing or diminishing health. We can get a wide variety of hormones from the sample. We can get hormones that measure stress, that measure reproductive success. So we can measure pregnancy, and that means we can also measure spontaneous abortion in them. We can measure nutritional health from these hormones. And we can also measure endocrine disruption, which is when the hormone system is disrupted, which can happen from a variety of different things, but most especially from toxins. We measure toxins in the feces as well. We can measure PCBs, which is one of the most prevalent toxins in the Salish Sea. That comes from any kind of industrial material that needs to be flexible, like the caulking on windows of major buildings, the coating on wire, paint. Another big toxin is PBDE, which is a chemical that's been used historically as a flame retardant. A third one is DDT congeners, now called DDE, is the primary breakdown product of this. And this is important to note because these are all called persistent organic pollutants, at least these three right here. And DDT, you may know, was banned in 1973, but it's still quite prevalent in the ecosystem, largely dispersed through the food chain. These things are fat, these toxins are fat loving, they're bioaccumulated in the animal's fat throughout their lifetime. And one of the things that we've shown, I'm not gonna really talk about this today, but when the animals really start to experience intense nutritional stress, they start to metabolize their fat, which releases these toxins that are otherwise sequestered in their fat where they can do the most damage. And then another toxin that we get that shouldn't be called a persistent organic pollutant, but it's PAH. This is a primary chemical of petroleum. So you can get different kinds of this from the actual oil itself, or also breakdown products when the fuel is burned. We can also get pathogens from these samples. We can get parasites and diseases from the samples. We most recently were able to identify that there are a number of tetracycline resistant bacteria in the whale species from dumping of sewage into the system. Same kind of bacteria that cause uterine tract infections in women. And we can measure immunoglobulins, so look at immune health. So really, when you look at all this together, it's essentially analogous. What we get from a single fecal sample, it's analogous to a health panel that a doctor may take from you and can tell a great deal about the health of the animal without, in our case, having to see the patient, being the whale. So the fecal samples are an extremely valuable tool, and by using the detection dogs, it really facilitates our ability to collect a large number of these samples so that we can see how all of these variables are changing over time with pressures associated with increased boat traffic or decreased salmon abundance or what have you. Well, one of the hormones that I want to talk about first is called glucocorticoid or glucocorticoid hormone. Sometimes it's also known as cortisol. Its real name is glucocorticoid because what it does is it causes the mobilization of glucose into the system. So that means that not only is this hormone really important when you have disturbance stress, any kind of emergency where you might need glucose to escape a threat, cortisol will go up, and that will cause you to have increased glucose and increased energy to escape. But also, even more significant is the response of glucocorticoids to nutritional stress. When you're running out of food, this causes the release of these glucocorticoids, which essentially mobilize glucose so that you have the energy to find food. So that's very important. And what it means is that when nutritional stress is low, glucocorticoids are very low because you've got plenty of energy. But when nutritional stress becomes high, glucocorticoids go up to give you energy to go find food. Well, because we can collect samples over time, we were able to use these glucocorticoid measures to see whether or not the physiological stress on the animal was due to fish. So that's this graph here, which is called, says the log of CPUE. That's the catch per unit effort of Chinook salmon going up the Fraser River, which is the primary source of food for these whales during the late spring to early fall when we're studying them most in the Haro Strait. And you can see that when the whales arrive in our study area around this time of year, this is the 120th day of the year to the 300th day of the year. And you can see when they first arrive, the number of Chinook salmon are relatively low. And then over time, this is like the middle of August, Chinook salmon become relatively high, and you can see this pattern persist across years. Here are the years. And then as you get into the into fall, the numbers decline again. So we can look at how glucocorticoids change in response to these fish. Interestingly, you also can look at the same trend with respect to vessels, especially whale watch boats, and that's what you're seeing here. And one thing to note is that, again, in the early spring, there's not that many whale watch boats out there because the weather is miserable and it's not that attractive. But you get this peak here, also not too far away from the peak here in fish. And then it declines again as the weather gets nasty. So these two patterns are very much parallel each other. Well, one thing that's really interesting is that because glucocorticoids go up with disturbance stress, so that's like this. So if it's stress from vessels, you would expect the glucocorticoid pattern to mirror this pattern here of vessels. But it also goes up with nutritional stress, which would be here and here. So here and here. So, and lowest here when you get the most food. So if it's fish that's causing the big physiological stress of the animal, you should get a smile in glucocorticoids. And if it's vessel traffic, you should get a frown. And when you look, we get a smile. So it means that the pressure is really caused by the fish, much more than by vessel traffic. Both are important, but really what seems to be driving this is the amount of fish. Another hormone that we measure that is tied to nutritional stress is thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is a very important hormone because it controls our metabolism. And so when an animal is food stressed, what will typically happen is thyroid hormone is lowered. And what that does is it slows the animal's metabolism down so that he doesn't burn up the remaining resources in his body and has more time to actually find food. So when you really get into a severe starvation state, thyroid hormone is relatively low. But when you first start to run out of food, so you've been eating well and you still have plenty of reserves left, and cortisol is going up because you're starting to feel the pain of the lack of food. Thyroid hormone stays high at that early stages because it keeps the metabolism high. So the glucose that is being released by the cortisol hormone essentially can be used most effectively to give you high energy with a high metabolism so that you can find the food. And then as the food stress persists, then thyroid hormone will typically plummet. And interestingly, when you look again at the food stress, this is the thyroid hormone that, again, showing you. It's really interesting that when the whales first arrived in our study area, right here, when the fish is relatively low, we see that thyroid hormone is extremely high. And what that means is or what that implies is that they have arrived in this area after having a fairly good amount of food. And then all of a sudden, the food pressure remains high, and then you see thyroid hormone plummet and then trying to catch up. So it suggests that somehow in the early spring, before they arrived, they were feeding on some very good food reserves. And we believe that food is from the Columbia River, the early Chinook salmon, the early spring Chinook salmon, the Columbia River. And indeed, if you look at the thyroid hormone levels in the animal over time, when they, year after year, this is over, again, this same time span. So for 6 years, you see that the higher the Chinook abundance at the Columbia River of early spring Chinook, essentially the higher is the thyroid hormone when they arrive, and it stays high. So it implies to us that this early spring Chinook may be really, really important to these animals. The other thing that I want to just talk about here is that we also are able to measure pregnancy in these animals. And so we measure that with the hormones progesterone and an androgen as well. And we can tell reliably when we see pregnancy in these animals. And then we can tell whether the animals actually, because they're all photo ID'd and we can track them over time, we can tell whether the animals had a successful pregnancy and actually gave birth, or whether they experienced a miscarriage and spontaneously aborted. And we have been able to, we showed that about 69% of the conceptions in these killer whales are miscarrying, spontaneously aborting. That's an extremely high rate of miscarriage. And when you look at, if you just kind of remember this pattern here, this is for all animals in the population, and then we look at this for we look at how this pattern changes for pregnant animals, then we see a very similar trend. But what I want you to notice here is that this is not just T3 here. This is the ratio of thyroid hormone T3 to glucocorticoids. So remember that when nutritional stress is low, glucocorticoids are low, and it increases when nutritional stress is high. And thyroid hormone does the opposite. Thyroid hormone is high when nutritional stress is low, and it is low when nutritional stress is high. So if you take the ratio of these two, it means that if you have a high ratio, high T3 and low GC, like you see here, that means you're in really good nutritional stress. And if you have a low ratio, like here, that means you are experiencing much poorer nutritional stress. So this red line are pregnant females over time across the year that had a successful birth. And the blue lines are ones that had an unsuccessful birth, which means that they were observed to be pregnant and then they aborted. And it still shows the same trend that when they arrive, those values are high. And I mentioned in the previous slide that this we believed was because of the early spring Chinook of the Columbia River that are so vital for them. What makes those early spring Chinooks so incredibly important is that they have an extraordinarily long migration. I think it's about 900 miles. Joseph will correct me if need be, but that's a relatively long migration for a fish. And when the fish reach the mouth of the river and begin their migration, they stop eating. So these early spring Chinook are believed to be arriving in early spring because they have such a far distance to go until they spawn. And when they do arrive, they have to be incredibly fat laden so that they can make this migration without eating. And we initially said that we thought that, you know, when we saw this trend of them when they're arriving with a really high nutritional status based on the thyroid hormone, we thought, well, what could they be eating that is so fatty? And that was what led us to think about the early spring Chinook. And it was interesting because when we first proposed this, a lot of people thought that we were crazy. But then they put radio tags on several Chinook salmon from the different pods, and they looked to see, well, where are they in, you know, between January to May? And what they found is that a vast majority of the time they are spending at the mouth of the Columbia River in this early spring period, both for K-pod and for L-pod. So when you look at the biology of these whales, you know, they're in our study area from late May to late October, give or take. And then they're out in the open ocean. So they're foraging, depending on which pod you have, but K and L at least are foraging down here in the wintertime, and J-pod is more up here. But these salmon, I mean, these killer whales, when they're foraging here in the winter, they don't have these big adults that are going up the mouth of a river that they can focus on in their feeding strategy. So they're eating a much more diverse or much more diverse size range and age range of these salmon. They also have higher thermoregulatory demands during the winter time. And so when spring comes and they're starting to move back up, they really need to be replenished from the long, harsh winter, the killer whales do. And not only that, but it's really important that this replenishment sustains them until the Chinook salmon in the Fraser River peak. And that peak, as I showed you in earlier graphs, is not until the middle of August. So we have to go from, you know, the early to mid-spring all the way to the middle of August before they really get a good abundance of Fraser River salmon, if they are abundant. And there used to be many other fish runs that peak in between those times, but they have been, Chinook salmon, they have been virtually eliminated entirely. So this makes the Columbia River spring run especially critical to replenish these whales from a harsh winter and sustain them until the Fraser River runs peak, particularly because so many other runs in between those times are now virtually gone. And this impact of the two primary sources of salmon for these killer whales from spring through fall really is illustrated here, the kind of interplay between the two. So this is looking at the abundance of Columbia River Chinook in orange and the Fraser River Chinook in blue. And so you can see the relative difference in timing of these two runs. And you can imagine that if this run is very low and this one doesn't peak until late, you're going to be in big trouble. So you can see year after year how these two runs play off each other. And interestingly, this year here, 2010 was one of our best years for births that we've had in our study area. This year here, 2013, was the worst, no births at all And you can see the Chinook run is low, and it takes a while for the Fraser River to peak. Here's another good year, 2015. So the point is that these Columbia River early spring Chinook are really, really vital to the success of these killer whales and their ability to sustain themselves. And this affects everything, because toxins, for example, as I mentioned earlier, may be very important, but we've also been able to show that as the number of fish decrease, we start seeing an increased amount of toxins in their feces. And that's because they're burning fat and they're releasing it into circulation, and then they're pooping it out. Similarly, boat traffic may be causing them a lot of disturbance, but if there's a lot of fish there, it doesn't impact as much their ability to find these fish because there's plenty of them. But when there's very little fish, then the number of boats really do impact their ability to find fish. And so there's a strong interaction. All these factors may be important, but really prey is at the core. And we believe that the early spring runs of Chinook are particularly important in this system for the reasons that I just described. And this is just showing you, just kind of wrapping things up, how the Columbia River salmon, based on catch at the abundance calculations that are made at the number of fish coming into the at the Bonneville Dam. And you can see here that, here's the early spring runs in blue. You can see they're getting quite low, over time. This is the summer runs in green, and then the fall runs, which are also important in orange. Basically, we're getting a considerable decline in these whales. And then I'm nearly done here. I can see Joseph coming on the screen. So, and this is showing you the Fraser River runs based on the catch per unit effort. Between 1981 and 2019, you can see what their pattern has been over time from April to October. Well, look at this year. Flat as can be all the way up to July. And then it wasn't till the beginning of August that we finally started to see an increase. The fish are essentially gone. And over time, historically, when you look at the run sizes of the Columbia River, you can see that historically they were considerable compared to the present. So there really has been a serious decline in the Chinook, and that is really a problem for the system. So one of the things that we can ask, so what do we do about it? Well, of course, there's a lot of interest in taking out the Snake River dams. And one of the things that this will do, not only will this increase fish passage into the area, but it will open up this huge amount of area, which is really, really valuable spawning ground for both Chinook salmon and for steelhead. So we believe that taking out these dams are one of the most impactful things that we can do to improve the recovery of these Chinook. Of course, there are plenty of other factors going on. There's bycatch, there's loss of habitat, there is global warming, which impacts, all this are impacting spawning of these animals. All of these things are important, and they're really, we need to do all of them. But if you really are asking for the biggest bang for your buck, it really seems that taking out these dams is the best way forward. So that's all I want to say. I want to thank people that have supported our work in the past, and I want to thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have moving forward.
Sam, thank you so much for that presentation. I've just learned more every time I listen to you. I feel like I learn more, and that was excellent. Before we go into question and answer, and we will, I want to introduce Giulia to come on and speak for a few minutes. And while I think Sam has done an excellent job talking about the ecology and the science of orca, Giulia, I think, will complement that with a discussion more on the sort of policy, political side, and with that, we'll then go into question and answer with all of you in the audience. There haven't been any questions posted so far in the Q&A box. So it's open and available to people, but people have been making some comments in the chat box. Either way works, but you can put those in at any time, and after Giulia's presentation, we'll shift into a moderated discussion with your questions. Giulia, are you there?
Hi, I'm here. Can you see me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Okay. Shoot.
There you go.
Am I there? Okay. Hi, everyone. As Joseph so kindly introduced me here, I'm going to try to, apologies for the tech funniness, but I'm seeing Joseph's face when I speak, so. My name is Giulia Good-Stefani. I'm a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I work in our oceans division, and more specifically at our marine mammal protection project, which means essentially that my clients are whales, and my favorite clients are the southern resident orcas, or killer whales. I, as Joseph noted, started this work, well, I met Joseph about 5 years ago, and at that time, we were looking to see what we could do for this population that we identified as one of the most endangered marine mammal populations in the country and that we were aware of. And research like Sam's very quickly led us to conclude that it had to be something on the prey side. So I do, as Joseph mentioned, live in Mosier, Oregon, on the banks of the Columbia River. This work brought me right back to home and working, although I'm an oceans attorney, in inland environment. And I think I'll just jump in with two quick stories and then let you all ask me more in the Q&A. The first is, I want to give you a little just history story and the story of one of the most beloved southern residents named Granny, or J2, who many of you I'm sure on this call are very familiar with. But for those of you who aren't, I'd like to just sort of give you a lens into the southern residents and their plight through Granny. I'm going to start the story in 1905. There's a U.S. Supreme Court case. This is before Granny's birth, but only by a few years, surprisingly. U.S. Supreme Court case called U.S. versus Winans, which is about Yakima tribal members' access to Celilo Falls, which is one of the most sacred and well-established and important fishing sites for Native people in the Pacific Northwest. It's on the Columbia River, not just a few miles from where I live today. And the Supreme Court at that point ruled there were two white brothers who were trying to obstruct access to the falls, that fishing for Native people in the Columbia Basin was as essential to their survival as the air they breathed. And I'm paraphrasing, but those were approximately the words. A few years later, Granny is born. At this point, she's a young orca whale, and there are 16 million approximately salmon returning to the Columbia Basin. It is arguably the most productive salmon river on the planet. And its largest tributary is the Snake River. The Snake River produces approximately half of the salmon in the basin, and huge numbers of those spring Chinook that Sam was talking about. A few years later, Bonneville Dam is constructed, 1934. A few years after that, the Dalles Dam is constructed. It floods out Celilo Falls, having huge impacts on the tribal communities here in the Pacific Northwest, as well as, I would argue, on the whales already at that point. Then there's great debate in the region about building dams on the Snake River. There's a proposal to build 4 dams on the lower Snake. These dams are intended to create an inland port in the city of Lewiston, Idaho. They're predominantly for transportation, so that wheat grown inland can be transported out to the coast. They will also have a hydropower element. They are, even at that time, reports are being conducted by state agencies, and they are concluding that approximately 50% of the salmon will die if these dams are constructed. Others have much more dire predictions, including state reports saying this may be the end of really the thing that kills Columbia Basin salmon. The dams go in, nevertheless. I just want to make sure I'm following my timeline. These dams go in the 60s, early 70s. Altogether, 400 dams have been constructed on the Columbia and its tributaries. It is the most dammed river system on the planet now. 40% of historic salmon spawning habitat has been blocked by dams in the Columbia. 1985, about 10 years after the Snake River dams were built, Snake River coho salmon go extinct. There are, for those of you who are salmon scientists, this is not news to you, but for me, I had to learn there are many different kinds of salmon and runs of salmon. In total, 106 runs of salmon have gone extinct in the Columbia Basin, which is an area, just sort of for scale, about approximately the size of France. Anyway, I'm going to bring us up to the early 90s. At this point, Granny is about 80 years old. Just sort of try to fathom the change in world she has experienced, from an abundance of 16 million salmon to just a small fraction of that after the dams are constructed. Now 1% of Snake River spring Chinook return to the Snake River Basin to spawn. That is not enough to avoid extinction. That is a very, very small percentage of what historically returned. It has left the whales without enough to eat, and the Snake River system just a whisper away from extinction, which is why us lawyers have been involved for about 20 years. Not me personally. I have to give credit to Earth Justice, which has led this litigation for a number of organizations, and the Nez Perce Tribe always has been a very strong leader here, and as has the state of Oregon. We've had approximately 20 years of litigation, a major win in 2016. Judge Simon ruled the system jeopardized, the hydropower system jeopardized the continued existence of salmon. And what I will say has changed, and this is my second story here, is the advocacy and the connection between the southern residents and the Columbia Basin system. And this is really with credit to scientists like Sam and advocates like all of you who are attending this this webinar, or hopefully will become if you're not already. Over the past few years, I've seen a tremendous evolution in the advocacy for these whales, and this is where I will sort of try to wrap things up. I do want to leave you, actually, before I wrap it up, with just a thought on Granny and the importance of grandmothers. So Granny died in January of 2017, or that's when she was announced dead. The grandmothers in the killer whales are only one of 3 mammals that goes through menopause. They live for a long time past reproductive, when they're their reproductive prime, or able to reproduce, and it's because the grandmothers are so important. They live in matrilineal pods led by the grandparents, and that's because these grandmothers show them where to hunt and fish and when, and are also important in helping to hunt. And in fact, when a grandmother is missing, the survival rate plummets for particularly adult males, but also baby calves, I believe. Sam will know that science better than I will, but I find that piece of it fascinating. Jumping into the advocacy in present day, I would say when I first sat in on meetings about the Columbia Basin salmon management, hydropower, I was seen as an oddity. What was this woman who litigates for whales and is talking about killer whales doing here? And that is no longer the case. There has been just a really profound evolution in the understanding, but between the connection in the the success of the runs in the Columbia Basin, the historic importance of them to the southern resident orcas, and the decline that we're seeing now in both the whale population and Columbia Basin salmon. And I'd like to name a couple of areas before I close. So Governor Inslee put together a Washington State task force for orca recovery. He also requested a $1 billion budget for orca and salmon recovery that led to some Lower Snake River stakeholder conversations around the state. It also led to the raising of the dissolved gas levels on the dam so that more water could be spilled for salmon. The Department of Ecology recently issued 401 certifications under the Clean Water Act, requiring the dams to regulate and meet state water quality standards for temperature, which they haven't done for forever, and are particularly not doing now under climate with increasingly hot summers. Governor Brown has stepped forward here in the state of Oregon, where I live, and announced early 2020 her support for Lower Snake River dam removal and a comprehensive solution to this decades-old problem that takes care of all of the various interests involved. Governor Little in Idaho started a salmon working group, and Representative Simpson, a Republican from Idaho, announced last April his desire to see salmon come back to Idaho and his commitment to make that happen, and willingness to look at Lower Snake River dam removal. And I would give just credit for the tremendous progress that we've seen to all of the advocates and all of the scientists working on this. It has been a science-led effort, but it is a political fight. The litigation will continue, and it has continued, but the judges have their limitations on what they can do. And I'll end with a figure that I heard in my most recent meeting with staff in Governor Brown's office, that she was receiving 106 letters from salmon and orca advocates a week, and that this is the type of thing that's keeping this issue front and center for our Regents decision makers. And I just encourage you all to keep at it, and happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Giulia. That's great. I'm sure there'll be some questions to follow. Sam, you're there. Just want to thank you both, and some questions are coming in. I'll do my best to moderate this a bit. One question, Sam, has come in regarding, I think, basically your presentation and some of your data and timelines. People, I mean, some of those visuals were pretty dense with a lot of information. And I'm wondering, is that something that presentation, the PowerPoint presentation, something that we can make available to people after this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. And I noticed one question from Kelly Balcom. I think he said I made a false statement. It looks like, but I think he made a mistake when he was writing this. He said there are not 100 whales present around whales state. I think he meant there are not 100 boats present around the whales. So yeah, and that was not meant to be that statement that sometimes there may be as many as 100 boats around 10 whales. That was an extreme. That's not at all an average, just to show you how bad it can be. And there certainly are less boats now around, but well, especially this year, there's no boats around because of the pandemic. But there still are an enormous amount of boats around, and we do collect the number of boats every 30 minutes. I don't have that number at the top of my head, but it's a bit moot because our work is really showing that really the greatest impact on these whales are the lack of fish. And there is no question that the boats are also nagging on them. We know that there's a lot of behavioral responses that are occurring in response to the boats, and you know, the number is in my mind less important, but those data are available. I just don't have them at the top of my head.
Okay, Sam, we can work offline. If it's okay, I'll take a copy of your presentation, and people can reach out to SOS if they're interested in a copy of that, if that's okay. Thanks for that. That was just going to bear with me while I look. There was a question from David Lynn, who's asking if the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife commissioners ask you for your input when they're making decisions, when they're faced with decisions on salmon policy. Is the Fish and Wildlife Commission reached out to you for your expertise?
I have given talks to them in the past. They haven't reached out to me recently. Deborah Giles, who does the majority of the field work for us right now, she was also on the government's panel. She's also shares information with them on a regular basis. But really, the answer is not so much. You know, that's one of the reasons why we publish our work, so it's there, and they certainly know it's there, and have expressed appreciation for it being there. I don't know about the commission, but the staff at Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife is really who I deal with, and yeah, so. Okay.
These questions are coming in at different topics, so we're just going to bounce around a little bit. A question came in from Colleen, Sam, about the scat, and just sort of diving into that for a moment. Does the scat float? How does the dog actually detect it?
Yeah, you've heard the expression, right? Sorry. Poop floats, you know, or I don't say poop. Anyways, yes, it does float for about 30 minutes under good water conditions. And if the water is choppy, it tends to pull apart the scats, and then it sinks more quickly. And it really is highly variable from one sample to the next. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is to figure out what makes a scat sink quicker than others. And we think it's tied to the percent of fat or lipid in the scat. But yeah, it does float long enough for us to get the samples. We often don't get all of the sample. Sometimes we get, like a thimble full. Sometimes we get, a lot, and everything in between.
But the dog's picking it up from scent on the wind, basically. It has to be, is it directional? Okay. Yeah,
the dogs will hit it, they can hit it literally a nautical mile away. And I had a slide that showed how we do this, but I think I took it off. But I can tell you that, essentially what happens is that we're following the whales, and we know what direction the tide is going. We know what direction the wind is blowing, and we know where the whales are. So the whales are always in view when we're sampling. And what we do is we approach the whales perpendicular to the wind, on the side that the tide is moving the sample, is in the ideal situation. And when the scat is in the water, it has what we call a scent cone. It's like literally a cone that comes off from the sample. When the wind is really strong, the cone is narrow, but it goes really far. And when the wind is weak, the cone is very wide, but doesn't go very far. And these dogs are, their primary reward is a ball. They will do anything for their ball, as is the case for most detection dogs. And what we do is that, so the dog is on the bow of the boat. He might be even sleeping, but you can kind of see his nostrils going up and down. And when you hit the edge of that cone, the dog is going, oh man, I'm going to get my ball. And he's up over the bow of the boat. So his change of behavior tells us that he's got the scat scent. So we continue going perpendicular to the wind into the center of the cone, where the concentration of the scent is strongest. And then pretty soon the boat passes the strongest point, so that now the strongest point of the scent is on the side of the boat, on the windward side, and the dog leans over that side of the boat looking for where the scent is strong. So we know to turn in at 180 degrees there. And we still may be a quarter mile from the sample at this point. And so then you just got to watch the dog's really subtle signals to bring you into the sample. It's very, very difficult. It's the most, we do detection dog work on a huge number of different animals. And this is by far the most difficult work that we do, because you have to keep all these things in mind, because you're essentially the dog's legs. Whereas, when you're working a dog on land, they know to go where the scent is strongest. They don't have to tell you, you just watch them.
And you're racing against the clock, because
yeah, exactly.
The scat will disappear. Thanks, Sam. Another a question from Karen. Is there any way to bring Chinook for orca, bring in Chinook for the orca to help them while we wait for the dams to be removed? And I'll just say we're not waiting, we're working at it, but I understand your point. Sam or Giulia, any thoughts on sort of somehow feeding Chinook to orca?
I think that it's crazy. I think that how are you going to do it? People have tried releasing hatchery, have used hatchery fish as a way to supplement the whales, but it creates so many other problems that impact wild salmon. We had a case where we had a starving whale that they were trying for a long time to recover, and they were going to release salmon for this whale to kind of sustain it. And how are you going to do that? You're going to throw a dead salmon over the side? Well, the whale is not going to eat that. How are you going to give it to that starving whale and not another whale? It's so complicated. All of these things they're band-aids, and what they do is they make us feel better. What we really need to do is to realize that we have to recover these wild salmon if we want a long-term solution. And one of the problems is that when you start to provide these human-made solutions to the problem, like supplementing them, then you think, oh, I'm off the hook, I've done something, and you remove the pressure on people to do the right thing. So I really, personally, others may feel differently, but my personal opinion is that's a big mistake and really not feasible.
Giulia, I think I've got a question for you from Marguerite. The science seems clear, hard work and advocacy efforts outstanding, but the dams are still up and the whales continue to starve. How do we get them down? I think it's sort of a question looking forward a little bit of, I guess maybe a little more detail about where you see we are now and the kind of work that needs to be done to restore this river.
It's a challenging question. We are confronted, Joseph and I, and the advocates on this issue with that question on a daily basis. And there is a tremendous amount of political pressure that needs to be built, continue to be leveraged. And in addition, there's, as I mentioned, there are a large number of stakeholders and sovereigns and varied interests in a wide geography that's impacted by a change in the management of the current hydropower system. So it is going to require the sort of comprehensive solution that looks at impacts to the energy system, that looks at impacts to the transportation system and agriculture, and ensures that tribal treaty rights and trust obligations are being fulfilled. So it is a very complex problem. As a lawyer, I will say I don't think litigation alone will get us there. I think the litigation will continue. We have landed now at the end of a new environmental impact statement, and we are disappointed, to say the least, with the outcome. It is very similar to the prior environmental impact statements and plan for the operation. So I expect the litigation to continue. But in addition, what I would say is the way that this is going to happen is by a ton of political pressure on our Northwest decision makers to really engage in finding a solution here. There are solutions, and we just need the willpower to figure out another way to operate this system without compromising on our clean energy goals, and by keeping everybody whole, but getting us abundant salmon and two of our most beloved species not going extinct.
I'll just follow and add that as someone who's worked on this issue for over 20 years, and it's been a long haul, and it's been driven by court and advocates working with the Nez Perce tribe and Oregon through court have forced changes in river operations, dam operations, to buy some time and create a little bit of space for these fish while we continue working on the big solutions, and the lower snake is the big solution in many respects in the Columbia Basin because of the tremendous restoration potential, which scientists identify as about 70% of the restoration potential in the basin is found in the Snake River system, and it was once home to more than 1 million spring Chinook every year. That habitat's still there; it's intact. As someone who's worked on this issue for a long time, I'm as optimistic as I've ever been. With the momentum. Giulia has alluded to it, the emerging leadership from Governor Brown and Inslee, from Congressman Simpson. There's a number of different conversations going on in the region today, which really haven't occurred before. There is tremendous urgency, and we don't have much time, but we've gotten to where we are in part because of the work of the scientists like Sam and salmon scientists and others. And in the work of advocates at all different levels. And, all I can say is that we, as frustratingly slow as it is, there's tremendous opportunity here, and we've got to keep keep up that work. There's, we just can't let up. We're having an impact. Change is, I think about other movements where people have pushed for a long time, and then all of a sudden, the door flies open, and a tremendous amount of progress is made. I'm optimistic we're on the edge of that kind of shift, but we've got to keep pushing. I want to return back a question to Sam. There was a bump in salmon numbers between 2013 and 2015. And a bump in orca births. Is that right? And if so, can you explain why the salmon numbers were higher in those years, presumably that resulted in additional births?
Yeah, there was a bump in 2010 and a bump in 2015. And we don't know for sure why that happened, but when I showed you the graphs of the Chinook, the Columbia River Chinook run peaks relative to the Fraser River run peaks, it looked like those two bumps corresponded with relatively good years between the two runs. So there's so many factors going on here that it's really hard to give a perfect answer when you have this few number of whales. Then losing one whale is a pretty heavy loss. But just to be to let you know how complicated this is, for example, either the Columbia River run or the Fraser River run could have a huge peak but very short-lived, so a big spike in fish over a short period of time. Well, that's a lot of fish, but it doesn't do the whales that much good because they can only eat so much during the period that the peak is high. So you really want the peak to be, it doesn't necessarily have to be as high as one might imagine, but sustained. It needs to be moderate and persist. Each of those peaks, that's the first thing. And then the second thing is the relative difference in the timing of the two runs. When does the Chinook run end relative to when does the Fraser run begin? And those two things seem to be very important, but it's imprecise. I mean, we're basing those fish numbers on catch per unit effort, and we're assuming that corresponds to everything. So, that's the challenge with science, is you just use your best guess based on all of the data. The thing is, there's not that many peaks in births. You know, there's really been 2 since 2006. So it's bad.
I might add a couple things, at least for the Columbia Basin, which I'm more familiar with, on the salmon side, and that is the early teens, 7, 8 years ago, was a time of high spill, which was court ordered. It was a time of good precipitation in the watershed, which meant there was a lot of in 10, 11, 12, there was a lot of water pushing the smolts out to the ocean quickly. And then the ocean conditions, and this is one of the factors that sort of contributes to the overall success of salmon survival and reproduction, is the condition of the ocean can be productive or not productive. And it just varies a bit and cycles a bit, and is not always predictable. There was a period where those conditions all really lined up nicely, and Chinook returns were significantly higher than they had been in previous years. And I think that the southern residents benefited from that, and we saw it in the numbers of birth they bore in if it was 14 or 15, for example. So the oceans are a factor. It's productivity or high productivity or low productivity. We don't have much control over that. It's always been that case. How we manage our river systems, the health of the rivers, their connectivity, reservoirs versus actual river, which is what salmon have evolved for. That's where we have play a huge role, of course, and we do. And folks are focused on making some key changes that are going to be needed, I think, to sustain Snake River fish and orcas that rely on them. A question came up that Josie asked, do any of you think the Snake River dams will be taken down? It seems like it's the only way we can save Chinook and the southern resident orcas. Giulia, Sam, you want to take a stab at responding to that question?
I do believe the Snake River dams will be removed. What keeps me working late at night, though, is the timeline, right? Like, these species don't have a lot of time. We are seeing the southern residents at perilously low numbers, and as Sam pointed out, the females are particularly important, and the number of reproductive females is very low. And the salmon, similarly, particularly with climate change and increasing water temperatures, are at terrible risk in the current configuration of the hydropower system of extinction. And so I believe the Snake River dams will come out. The equation in favor of those dams continues it to become less and less, make less and less sense. They are aging infrastructure. There's a decrease in the amount of transportation in the river. As we get warmer winters and there's less snowpack, those dams provide energy at the periods of time when the region doesn't need that energy. And so their importance in the energy system is also declining. I believe that the right thing will happen here. The question for me is whether or not we can do it in time for these species, and that's why I think it's really important that we all maintain a level of urgency around this push.
You addressed a question that came up that I'll just acknowledge, which is there enough time? It's urgent. I don't think it's one can easily say, I'll just jump in here, there's enough time or there's not enough time. I think it's what we've got to do. What I've said recently in response to the 2 new calves that have been born, one to Telequa this last month, is the orcas are doing everything they can, and we need to be doing our part too, which gets at a lot of the conversation here tonight. Another question that has come up from a number of people has to do with who are the prime decision makers, who do we need to reach out to? Giulia, maybe you could take a stab at talking about sort of politics and help orient people to, who they should be talking to.
So this is a multi-tiered issue. There are, I mean, obviously I've mentioned the governors here in the region, the principal ones being Governor Brown and Governor Inslee, who need to be thanked for their leadership on this and encouraged to continue. Idaho has a role to play, and the governor there, but then there's also the federal delegation. These are federally owned and operated dams. And our delegation members, our congressmen and our senators, Senator Murray, Senator Cantwell in Washington, Senator Wyden, Senator Merkley in Oregon, they need to be hearing from us that this is an issue that matters to us, that it's urgent, and it needs their attention, because it's been far too easy to leave the process in the state's hands, but it's really going to require a joint federal and state process. And then I'd encourage all of you to think locally as well. I mean, all of our congressional and state representatives also have people that influence them. Our local elected officials, our public utility districts, these are folks to have conversations with about what it is that matters to you and where their priorities should be. And it's another layer of reaching our elected officials. So Joseph may have some to add to that list, but that's where I would start.
Without knowing where everyone is who's attending this discussion, but probably concentrated in the Pacific Northwest, I mean, Giulia's right. I think in terms of the priority targets, political targets, if you will, are members of Congress in the three or four Northwest states: Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and the governors. That's whose leadership and engagement we need today. The feds just finished their effort after 4 years, and it basically is. It's a dead end. It's modest changes on a status quo that has failed for years and at great expense. We've got to have the regional leadership engaged and leading and committed to finding solutions and doing so with urgency. The other thing I'll just add is, and I think Carrie just added something to the chat room, there are some links that she can post where you can learn more about salmon and orca from our website, but also there's a take action page that has links to a number of alerts that are relevant and current right now that can help you both take action easily, but also take a look at a list of folks that we're particularly focused on right now. So thanks.
Joseph, I just wanted to
go ahead, Sam.
Add one thing, really two things. You mentioned Telequa's birth, which was important. Unfortunately, it was a male, yet again. So it's a little bittersweet. But I also want to point out something that is relevant to not only this current problem, but really so many problems that we are currently faced with. And that's the pandemic and our insane president that we currently have, and all of the so many things are front and center. Black Lives Matter, climate, and politicians are really kind of stretched to the limit right now. What are they going to worry about? And I think that it's really easy to kind of put your head in the sand at a time like this and just go, I can't take it anymore. What do I do? But, now more than ever, we really need to be speaking up to the causes that we care about. And, one good thing about having so many people on this earth, maybe the only good thing about it, is that we've got a lot of diversity of interests, and not everybody cares about one thing. We all have the things we care about, and people need to make sure that they speak up about the things that they care about, because that's the only way that we're going to get heard.
Thanks, Sam. You mentioned, I want to shift back to science. Sherry, you mentioned something about the Telequa's calf has been identified as a male. is something going on? Are they, there have been a lot of males produced or born recently, and is that just circumstance, or is there something else going on?
There is like 10 males to every female born. That number's not exact right now, but it's I have to look it up, but it's pretty close. It should be 50-50, given that it's, you know, really the flip of a coin whether you get a boy or a girl. So there's an extreme sex bias happening in these populations, and there are a number of hypotheses to explain that. It could be toxins impacting the hormonal system. Personally, what I believe is the single biggest cause is inbreeding. And the reason for that, without getting in too much detail, is, you know, implantation depends on the embryo being different from the mother, because it's almost like an allergic reaction. When the embryo arrives, it literally starts an irritation in the uterus that allows the trophoblast to invade and implant. And if the embryo is too similar to the mother, then you get a really weak implantation if it happens at all. And one of the things that impacts is that when you get a strong implantation, it tells the mother's immune system to shut down so that it doesn't gobble up this foreign object in its body, the baby. So if you get a weak implantation, not only is it likely not to hold, but the immune system may actually kill the fetus. And this is a common cause of habitual abortion in people also. Now, if you think about it, all else being equal, a male embryo is more different from the mother than is the female embryo, because the male has a Y chromosome. And so that's one of the reasons why when you have inbreeding, which occurs when you start to get a diminished population, that you're going to get a bias in favor of males. And the other thing to bear in mind that's unique about killer whales is that both the males and the females stay in their natal group throughout their life. In most other mammals, one sex or the other disperses. For mammals, it's usually the male. For birds, it's usually a female. But almost always, it's a universal response, is that one sex or the other leaves so that you don't get inbreeding depression, you know, impacts of inbreeding, which of course exposes you to lethal mutations. And so that's really a big factor for these killer whales, because usually what's supposed to happen in their natural history is when different pods come together, the male goes over to another pod and mates with the female and then comes back to his mom. And right now, all of these pods that these guys are encountering are so diminished that we are having serious inbreeding problems and serious inbreeding depression. That's been well documented.
Julie, anything to add?
No, just Sam, it's fascinating, and I really appreciate the science here. And once again, I mean, these are arguably the most studied population of whales on the planet. They are, referred to as residents because they are near shore, and they have had a tremendous amount of observation and data, and that's been incredibly helpful in identifying what they eat, where they eat it, when they eat it, and what's going on here.
We're coming up at the set to 7:30 Pacific Standard Time. I want to, the attendance has remained really strong, and I appreciate everyone's being here and asking these questions. This has been a great discussion. I think I want to say a couple things, because we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions that have come up. And then I want to give Sam, you, and Julia a chance to make a couple closing comments. First of all, if you've got questions that didn't get answered, and you could reach out to Carrie or I, and we'll try to find you a resource to get those questions answered. We're happy to talk and also connect people. There was a question that was sort of different than all the others from Karen Davis that I just want to acknowledge. And she's basically expressing a lot of frustration at the systemic obstacles that exist to getting good decisions made and getting good outcomes, including, for example, a restored lower Snake River. And she makes a reference to the presidential election and uncertainties around that. I'll just say, I agree, you're right. We've got work to do in this area that we've just been talking about, but the larger system in which we operate certainly is, in my mind, democracy in America is struggling today, and we've got to remain focused on maintaining a healthy democracy. So one thing, obviously, everyone can do is vote and engage in that larger process. I'll just leave it at that for now. So I think I'll just thank everybody for attending and hand it off to Sam and then Giulia for some closing comments, and we'll adjourn.
Much more to say other than, speak up. This is a really challenging time, and I also want to just point out one other thing. It's a really challenging time to do research on these whales because they're not coming into the Haro Strait anymore because there's no fish. And it's one of the craziest things that we've experienced where, we have a good amount of funding to study them, but they're not there because there's no fish. And that just kind of shows the challenges that we are faced with in trying to understand what's going on in the system. But anyways, I just want to say thank you to everyone, and especially you, Joseph, for hosting us. And Giulia, it's been a pleasure sharing the stage with you.
Thanks, Sam. And I will, I'll leave you all with a little, a drop of hope here, which is, we've had other dam removals in the region, and we have seen just tremendous returns to the Elwha. I live just across the river from the Conduit Dam on the Little White Salmon. And these are incredibly resilient, brilliant species. As Sam alluded to, this Snake River spring Chinook migrate some 900 miles, nearly 6,000 miles in elevation, longest migration of salmon that I'm aware of. I mean, they're making it over 8 dams right now. Just imagine if they only had to go over 4. The same for the southern residents. I mean, I don't know, Sam probably has other ideas about or more thoughts on why they're not showing up on the Fraser, but they are hunting for salmon. And if we can get the salmon out there, I believe they'll find them. So the species themselves inspire me. The people that work on this issue, I am by all measures, being about 5 to 7 years into this topic, a newcomer. There are so many devoted people who've spent their lifetime fighting for this issue, and I think there is real momentum here. A lot of that momentum has come with the connection between the orcas and the Columbia Basin, and that understanding. It is really there's been a real surge in love and appreciation and just the interconnection that salmon have to just about everything. So I have great hope. I think there is also a tremendous amount of work to be done, and none of us can stop working until it's there. And as Joseph said, the orcas are doing their part. We have 2 new baby calves, and the salmon are doing their part, fighting over those dams and continuing to spawn despite all the odds. So let's keep at it. And I'm just so grateful for all of the terrific advocates that I have met along the way. Everyone that writes letters, everyone that comes out to testify, that shows up to Zooms, that is calling their state, federal, local representatives. You all are making a difference, and let's not give up.
Thanks, Giulia. Sam, Giulia, it's really been a pleasure and an honor to spend this evening with you. So I really appreciate you taking time out to share it with us. Feel free to reach out to Carrie and I, afterwards and we'll help out however we can to answer questions and make connections. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Take care.